On the 6th of October, 1973, the 10th day of Ramadan, the Muslim holy month, and Yom Kippur, the holiest of holy days in the Jewish calendar, Egypt and Syria launched an all-out war against Israel. This first liberation of land occupied by Israel in the 1967 Six-Day War provoked an enthusiastic response across the Arab world.
فعلا الشعب المغربي تحمس كثيرا إلى هذه الحرب، وأحسن دليل على ذلك الحملة التي نظمت في كل المدن المغربية والسمى المدن الكبيرة، حملة للتبرع بالدم، وكانت حملة قوية جدا.
الرئيس الراحل هواري بومدين تبنى القضية وأخرج شيكا على بياض وقال للسوفيات هذا هو الشيك الذي تستطيعون أن تصرفوا منه أي شيء تريدونه في قضية السلاح، 100 مليون لمصر و100 مليون لسوريا في كل ما تحتاجه من سلاح وعتاد وقطع غيار وغيرها.
In October 1973, the Arab world seemed to have united behind a single precious goal. But the common purpose of Egypt and Syria, the two countries who started this war, was about to dissolve into acrimony and mistrust. The Syrian Golan Heights, occupied by Israel in the 1967 Six-Day War, still occupied to this day. This high plateau is a tranquil and beautiful place. But it is also scarred and defaced by the bloody fighting that took place here in October 1973. Memorials stand to the Israeli forces who fought a desperate battle to stop the Syrian thrust, which threatened to reach right to the heart of Israel. In the first 5 days of war here on the Golan, Israeli losses alone amounted to 250 tanks and hundreds of men.
It was ambitious for the Syrians to think that they could penetrate significantly into the Israeli rear over the course of 24 hours. But it was not wholly unrealistic. Had the Israelis not been able to respond flexibly, it is entirely possible that a Syrian exploitation force could have penetrated into northern Israel within a day.
But it was not to be. In less than 24 hours, Israel had mobilized 2 armored divisions, which soon turned the Syrian advance into retreat. On the 10th of October, and after suffering huge losses in tanks, the Syrians withdrew from the Golan Heights. Back behind the 1967 ceasefire line, the same place they had started their assault 5 days earlier. Now the Israelis faced a crucial choice. What should be their next move? The decision taken in Tel Aviv was typically bold: to go on the attack, to push on into Syria itself.
We're going to make it clear to the other side that the game of breaking the ceasefire is a two-sided one. And we are going to press, and we are going to push, and we are going to bomb, and we are going to punish as much and as long as we can until the other side does understand the rules of the game.
The effort to take Syria out of the war had already started the previous day, with strikes by the powerful Israeli Air Force.
במצב הכי גרוע חדרנו למרכז סוריה, לדמשק, והפצצנו את מפקדת חיל האוויר שלהם והמטכ"ל, את שניהם, את המטכ"ל ומפקדת חיל אוויר.
These were the first of a string of attacks targeting Syrian infrastructure.
And at that stage, the Syrian population would go up on the roof to watch the bombs fall and were still rather excited. The horrible truth hadn't yet sunk in that their country was in mortal danger.
Alongside the heavy aerial strikes, Israel would launch its ground offensive. 2 armored divisions would attack across the 1967 ceasefire line, known as the Purple Line, along the Damascus Road, towards the Syrian capital, 60 kilometers to the east. At first light on 11th of October, the assault began. Despite fierce Syrian resistance, the Israelis advanced, capturing territories deep inside the Syrian mainland.
بدأ الحصار عندما قام الإسرائيليون بهجوم مضاد ضخم جدا، فبدأت الفرقة الأولى تتراجع أمام الجيش الإسرائيلي. لما تراجعت الفرقة الأولى وهي تملك 250 دبابة تقريبا، الألوية وراها ألوية مشاة كانت، بدأت ألوية المشاة أيضا تنسحب، مما أدى إلى تقدم الجيش الإسرائيلي. أذكر أنه في ذلك اليوم أصدر الرئيس أمر بعزل قائد الفرقة وتعيين قائد آخر محله.
Stories emerged that Assad's punishment for his commanders went beyond mere dismissal.
أنا أذكر أنه حصل نعم ذلك، وفي أكثر من ضابط اعتقلوا، وفي منهم يقال أنهم أعدموا. في قائد كبير يقال أن الرئيس حافظ الأسد استدعاه وطلب منه يعني أن يحكم بنفسه على نفسه، فقتل نفسه الرجل بمسدسه أمام الرئيس.
Assad's rage was born of the anger he felt towards his allies in Cairo. The Egyptians had successfully stormed across the canal on the first day of war. They had quickly established a defensive bridgehead 10 kilometers deep and repulsed all the Israeli armored attacks. But since then, they had moved not an inch further east into Sinai.
فكان الرئيس الأسد يتصل هاتفيا بالرئيس سادات ويقول له: يا سيادة الرئيس، تقدموا القوات المسلحة الإسرائيلية كلها أمامنا، ونحن نتحمل الضرب الجوي الإسرائيلي بكامل القوات الجوية الإسرائيلية، ليس هناك ما يحول دون تقدمكم إلى الأمق اللي اتفقنا عليه. ولا جواب.
8 months earlier, at a meeting in Egypt, Sadat and Assad had forged a plan with a common purpose. They had agreed to launch a war against Israel on 2 fronts. But now it seemed the 2 presidents had entirely different concepts of the war they had planned together.
Assad told me that from the moment of his seizure of power, his ambition, his dream, was to avenge the defeat of 1967, when Syria had lost the Golan to Israel and when Assad himself had been defense minister. So I think he felt this sort of personal responsibility for the recovery of the land. Assad saw the war, which he was planning, as a war of liberation.
Sadat, on the other hand, had been planning for a limited war to focus the minds of the world's superpowers and jumpstart the stalled peace process.
أول ما رئيس سادات تولى الحكم اجتمع بينا في مارس 71، فهو قال لنا: عايز أحرك القضية وادوني بس 10 سنتي في الشرق وأنا أحل القضية.
A week into the war, Sadat's personal target had already been surpassed. It seemed a swift victory might be in sight. In the early hours of October the 13th, he was woken for an urgent meeting. the British ambassador had come with an offer to broker a United Nations ceasefire resolution. The Israelis, he told Sadat, were ready to accept the ceasefire based on the current positions.
צה"ל הוכה קשה, צה"ל לא צלח את תעלת סואץ, וצה"ל היה מוכן לקבל הפסקת אש, שזה תבוסה במונחים של אותם ימים, תבוסה נוראה, והיינו מוכנים לזה. מה שמראה שאיבדנו את התקווה שלנו לנצח במלחמה.
Seduced by success, Sadat now refused the British offer. He would only accept a ceasefire, he said, if Israel withdrew from the whole of Sinai.
Things were going very well for Sadat. He didn't want to stop the war. Something dramatic had to be done to persuade him to agree to a ceasefire, maybe even to get him to request the ceasefire. And the only thing that could work was crossing of the canal. That might scare him enough.
But the Egyptians, alive to the possibility, had held 2 armored divisions with over 200 tanks each and a second line of defense west of the canal. It was a problem of which Israeli Chief of Staff, General David Eliezer, was well aware.
Before crossing the canal, he wanted to draw those 2 armored divisions to the Israeli side for 2 reasons. One, not to have to cross while those 2 divisions are waiting for him on the bank of the canal when you're very vulnerable. Number 2, to have them on the Israeli side where he can meet them on Israel's terms.
General Eliezer was sure that a second phase of the Egyptian attack would begin on October the 9th, with those 2 armored divisions crossing the canal to advance on Sinai's strategic passes some 40 kilometers to the east. But the Egyptian plan was to stay put. Yet 48 hours later, President Sadat gave a new and surprising order to his war minister, General Ismail. They were to go ahead with just this second phase, the advance that Eliezer had been waiting for.
يوم 11 أكتوبر جالي أحمد إسماعيل وقال لي عايزين نطور الهجوم إلى المضايق. قلت له غير ممكن عشان كيت وكيت وكيت وكيت. جالي يوم 12 وقال لي يوم عايزين نطور الهجوم علشان نخفف الضغط عن سوريا. قلت له لا يمكن تخفيف الضغط عن سوريا للأسباب الآتية: إن هو العدو بيتمتع بقوات جوية ويستطيع أن يثبت أي جبهة. ويوم 12 تاني لثالث مرة قال لي لا، ده قرار سياسي وواجب التنفيذ.
After a long debate with Shazli, General Ismail issued orders to the commanders of Egypt's 2nd and 3rd Field Armies to begin the advance east.
يا دوبك وصلوا، بصيت لي كل واحد منهم بيكلمني بالتليفون: التعليمات اللي سيادتك بعتها مش هنقدر ننفذها. الكلام ده سمعته من سعد مأمون ومن عبانة من مصر، وسعد مأمون زاد عليها بأنه مستعد أنه يقدم الاستقالة بتاعته.
That night, the 2 commanders were summoned to Center 10, the Egyptian Armed Forces Command Center in Cairo.
لغاية الساعة 12 وأحمد إسماعيل زي الأسطوانة المشروخة: هذا قرار سياسي وواجب التنفيذ، وعدم تنفيذه يعتبر نوع من التمرد وقت الحرب. كل اللي قدرنا نعمله كانت القرارات القديمة إن الهجوم يبدأ يوم 13، فعطلناها 24 ساعة.
Ironically, at almost exactly the same time Egyptian commanders were arguing over an attack from west to east, the Israelis were locked in their own debate about an attempted crossing in the other direction. Attending this stormy meeting in Golda Meir's office was Zvi Zamir, the head of the Israeli intelligence, Mossad.
The meeting was held in Tel Aviv with the inner cabinet and the general staff. And in the middle of the discussions, someone entered and whispered into Zamir's ear, and he excused himself and went out.
Zamir returned with astonishing information from an impeccable source, a spy operating at the heart of affairs in Cairo. The Egyptians were on the point of moving their armored divisions across the canal. Next day, 13th of October, confirmation arrived in Israel. An American spy plane, the SR-71 Blackbird, had photographed the Suez Canal front with high-resolution cameras. Reconnaissance pictures showed the West Bank was suddenly empty of Egyptian tanks. The Egyptians were committing their biggest mistake of the war. The Israelis would do nothing to stop them.
إبراهيم العرابي قائد الفرقة 21 مدرعة في ذكرياته اللي قالها لي، قال لي أنا اندهشت وإحنا بنعبر من الضفة الغربية إلى الشرقية، كنت منتظر الطيران هيضربنا. قال لي ولا حد تعرض لنا، مفيش دبابة أصيبت في العبور من الغرب إلى الشرق، سابوه العبور.
The Egyptian plan was to make 4 simultaneous thrusts towards the Sinai strategic passes and crossroads. 3 of the assaults would be made by armored brigades. The central push would be by a full division, the 21st Armored. At 6:30 on the morning of the 14th of October, the Egyptian armor moved east.
So the one brigade commander I spoke to said it was like a flood in the Negev, water suddenly pouring down, suddenly out of the eruption of Egyptian tanks.
The Israelis were waiting for the tank assault in pre-prepared positions on the ridges east of the Egyptian bridgeheads.
Then all the tanks came up, and boom, 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 boom.
In the first few minutes of the battle, the Egyptian 21st Armored Division suffered significant casualties.
استشهد أحد قادة اللواءات المدرعة عقيد في ذلك الوقت السيد توفيق أبو شادي، كما أصيب رئيس أركانه واستشهد قائد لواء المدفعية. حصل نوع من الارتباك في النسق الأول.
ובהחלט הצלחנו לעצור עשרות, אם לא מאות, טנקים מצרים ולהעלות אותם באש, עם לא הרבה נפגעים בצד שלנו, בחלק הבלימתי, אני לא מדבר על שתי ההתקפות הכושלות.
By midday on the 14th of October, 250 tanks had been lost. The Egyptian General Command ordered all advancing forces to retreat westwards to the bridgeheads.
هي كانت محاولة لتخفيف الضغط على الجبهة السورية، ولكنها لم تفعل شيئا من هذا. كيف يمكن؟ ده بيننا وبينهم 500 كيلو، هيخففوا الضغط ازاي؟
In fact, by the time the Egyptians launched their attack, the Syrian front had already been stabilized. The Israelis had been forced to halt their advance by the arrival of Iraqi troops.
הגיעו והם נערכו בהפתעה מול היחידות שלנו. אנחנו נתנו התראה שהיחידות העיראקיות זזות לכיוון הגולן, אבל לא נתנו להם התראה על המקום, ואת זה הם גילו בהפתעה. אז חלק מהאשמה ניסו להטיל עלינו, אבל מה לעשות? ככה זה עובד.
The Iraqi 3rd Armored Division had moved swiftly from its bases around Baghdad towards the Golan, a distance of over 1,000 kilometers.
لما وصلنا مساء إلى منطقة تسمى الغوطة، كان هنالك أشخاص مدنيين مكلفين بالحراسات. العبارات اللي واجهونا بها في هذه الليلة، يعني نهاية ليلة 11، صدمتنا صدمة قوية. أنتوا العراقيين؟ نعم احنا العراقيين. الله يعطيكم العافية، الحقوا شرفنا. احنا نتصور يعني الموضوع يعني هو كله في تقدم، في انتصارات، هذه أول صدمة انصدمنا بها.
Despite their fatigue, the Iraqi forces were rushed to the front to reinforce Syrian troops retreating before the advancing Israelis.
בשעות הצהריים הרגשנו כבר שאנחנו פנימה בתוך השטח הסורי. העליתי כמה תצפיות, ראו איזה אבק, אבל חשבתי שזה כוח שלנו. ואז מפקד האוגדה, זה כבר היה דן לנר, עברתי פיקוד של אוגדה, לא משנה לצורך הסיפור שלנו. הוא אומר לי, כוח גדול נע לכיוון שלך, קרוב מאוד, כ1,000 מטר.
وفي هذا الموقف يعتبر هذا نصر استراتيجي للجبهة السورية بفعل القوة العراقية، وهذا التوقيت يعني لولا كان تأخير 24 ساعة كان الموقف يكون أكثر صعوبة، وكانت القوات الإسرائيلية تكاد أن تكون على أسوار دمشق.
5 squadrons of the Iraqi Air Force, some 60 aircraft, were flown to Syria to make up for losses sustained by the Syrian Air Force.
سووا في شكل زخم للطيارين السوريين، حتى اللي كان يريد يتردد يعني اندفع باندفاع كلش كامل. لين قال ذول الطيارين العراقيين يجون من العراق وينادوا يقاتلون أنا سوري في مكاني، فصارت فد ملحمة، يسابقون على تنفيذ الواجبات، يسابقون.
With the arrival and the participation of Iraqi forces in the war, the Jordanian army was now straining at the leash.
هذه الحقيقة أحرجتنا كثيرا، يعني أحرجت المرحوم الملك حسين كثيرا للسبب التالي: هنالك دولتان عربيتان أراضيهما احتلت عام 67، والأردن أيضا دولة عربية ثالثة احتلت أراضي منها في عام 1967. فتلك الدولتان تحاربان وأنت لا تحارب. وأذكر أنني حضرت معه واحد من اللقاءات اللي بلهم في القيادة العسكرية، وأحسست كم كانوا يضغطون عليه يريدون أن يدخلوا الحرب.
In the face of the present developments, the Jordanian forces entered Syria and have been heavily engaged in action throughout yesterday.
But the Iraqis and Jordanians were not the first to arrive. 5 months before the outbreak of the war, King Hassan II of Morocco had sent a brigade to support the Syrian front. The Moroccan brigade was given the name تجريدة.
تجريدة بالمناسبة هو تعبير مغربي يحيل على النجدة أو الحملة. فالمغاربة أعطوا حراسة السفوح الشرقية لمرسل جبل الشيخ.
More expeditionary forces would soon arrive from other Arab countries.
במובלעת הסורית מצאנו את המרוקאים, חטיבה מרוקאית. מאוחר יותר הגיעו העיראקים שלחמנו בהם, ומאוחר יותר הגיעו הסעודים, ומאוחר יותר הגיעו הירדנים. כלומר, מצאנו שם 4 צבאות שאנחנו לחמנו נגדם.
The Israelis had suffered heavy losses, but they had also achieved significant gains in the last 4 days. They had advanced to within 35 kilometers of Damascus and occupied new territories to bring to the bargaining table after the war. Now, their initial goals in the north achieved, the Israelis were about to turn their attention south to the Egyptians. The plan to cross the Suez Canal had been finalized and given the name Stout-Hearted Men. During the war in October 1973, Ariel Sharon was the general in command of the 143rd Reserve Armored Division, one of 3 facing the Egyptians in the Suez Front. A controversial personality, Sharon had already developed a plan to deal with any Egyptian attack during his 3.5 years as commander of the Southern Front. an assignment that had ended just 3 months earlier.
So then I asked him, what will happen, Ariel? Have you any doubt where this war is going to end? Where, I asked. On the other side of the canal. That's the only place where it can be terminated. This is the first time I hear that we are going to cross the Suez Canal. It was around 7:30, October the 6th, Yom Kippur, in his kitchen in Beersheba.
On the night of October the 9th, the 4th day of the war, Sharon sent his reconnaissance battalion west towards the canal. Surprisingly, no Egyptian forces intercepted them, and they quickly reached the shores of the Bitter Lake, where the waterway is up to 5 kilometers wide. Turning north, the Israelis entered 2 abandoned forts of the Bar-Lev line, Lakakan and Matzmed. The battalion had stumbled on a 40-kilometer wide, undefended gap between the Egyptian 2nd and 3rd armies. Sharon was electrified and radioed headquarters for permission to implement his strategy.
When Sharon tells them, we have to cross the canal, we have to arrive in their rear, they tell him, we cannot afford to do what you are suggesting, because you are the only division which we got intact. You are the only one between the enemy and Tel Aviv.
What's more, on October the 9th, there were still 2 Egyptian armored divisions on the western side of the canal, ready to counter any Israeli crossing. Sharon's plan was placed on hold, until 5 days later, when those 2 divisions suddenly crossed the canal and began their abortive advance deep into Sinai. Now the Israeli plan could be activated. The time had come for stout-hearted men. But to pull it off, the Israelis would need to transport a curious mix of equipment to the waterline.
They picked up in Europe a second-hand pontoon bridge the year before, a war surplus, and they'd also picked up floating rafts, mechanized rafts, which can carry a tank.
But third, and most important, was an actual bridge. Specially built in Israel, this was how the main forces would cross the canal.
The idea of the bridge, this roller bridge they call it, it was a bridge that was built intact. It was 200 meters long, metal bridge with metal rollers, iron rollers, but the rollers were filled with substance that floated. You pull it to the canal, but with tanks. When you reach the edge of the canal, you got tanks in the back just pushing it into the water, and you have a ready-made bridge.
But getting the 400-ton bridge to the water's edge, a 25-kilometer journey, was to prove harder than expected. Before the war, the Israelis had cut a dirt track specially designed for moving the bridge to a pre-prepared crossing point. But now that track was in Egyptian hands. A strong defensive position, the southern flank of the 2nd Egyptian Army, stood in the way of any Israeli advance. The battle to open the road to the canal would be called the Battle of Chinese Farm. Like farms on the eastern bank of the canal today, the area was an Egyptian agricultural development on which work had begun in the early 1960s with the help of Japanese experts. Occupied during the Six-Day War, the Israelis had mistaken the Japanese writing on irrigation equipment for Chinese. The farm had now been recaptured by the Egyptians. The 16th Division dug into dry ditches, now serving as trenches.
They had to engage the Second Army in a tank battle so that the bridges could reach the canal and the tanks could cross on the bridges.
At dusk on the 15th of October, the Israeli tanks started their assault on the Chinese farm. But the Egyptians would counter the attack using their new highly effective weapon, anti-tank guided missiles.
ואני זוכר את השיחה שהתנהלה בין המח"ט שלנו, טוביה רביב, לבין מפקד האוגדה אריק שרון, והוא אומר לטוביה רביב, 2, הוא קורא לטוביה רביב, כי זו הייתה החטיבה השנייה, מבין השלוש חטיבות שלו, הוא אומר לו 2 כד 40, 40 זה מפקד האוגדה, התקפה יפה מאוד, וטוביה רביב שהיה לו כל רומני מתגלגל, 40 כאן 2, מה שבוער זה שלנו עבור.
While Sharon's division was taking heavy casualties in the Chinese farm, a 750-strong Israeli paratroop force was advancing towards the canal across the dunes. By midnight, they had reached the crossing point.
The paratroop brigade reached the canal on half-tracks and carrying with them on the half-tracks rubber boats, and they crossed, uncertain of what they would find on the other side. And the first man to climb on the other bank yelled clear, and they knew there was no one there, and they established a bridgehead. So there was now an Israeli presence on the western bank.
But despite the desperate efforts of the Israelis, the road to the canal remained closed by an entire Egyptian infantry brigade. But there was one ray of light for the Israelis. Their mechanized rafts could move independently across open terrain. And by 6:30 on the morning of the 16th of October, 15 rafts had reached the canal and began ferrying tanks to the west.
Just when we arrive there, and it's quiet around, and we are there, on the canal. Sharon sends between 12 to 20 tanks across the canal. And what happens is exactly what he said. And it's in disarray. The Egyptians don't know what happens to them. For 24 hours. That arrival in the rear of the enemy was exactly what Sharon was aiming at. And the decisive phase of the war is closing now.
The Israeli canal crossing went almost unnoticed by the Egyptians. And later that same morning in Cairo, it seemed the head of state was totally unaware of what was going on at the front. In his first public appearance since the start of the war, Sadat led a victory parade through the streets towards Parliament. He was accompanied by War Minister General Ahmed Ismail. In a rousing speech, Sadat set out his conditions for a ceasefire, a total Israeli withdrawal from Sinai. Later that day, in Jerusalem, Golda Meir made her own speech. She decided to share the good news with the Israeli Knesset.
At 4:15 this afternoon, the Israeli population were told for the first time that their troops were on the west bank of the Suez Canal.
What Mrs. Meir said came as a surprise, not just to the Israeli people, but also to the Egyptian military. Israeli paratroopers and tanks had formed a limited bridgehead on the western side of the canal, in an area called Dever-Soir. But Egyptian reports about the Israeli crossing were confusing and underestimated the scale of the problem.
كان في مشكلة في الاستطلاع. كان معظم أو كل عناصر الاستطلاع في الناحية الشرقية. ما كانش في عناصر استطلاع في الناحية الغربية عشان تدي معلومات. عشان كده أنا يعني بقيت أسأل عن المعلومات في الغرب ما حدش عارفها كويس يعني.
It was only when the Israeli forces in the west went on the offensive that the Egyptians first grasped the extent of their problem, that the enemy was already in their backyard.
One of the tank brigade commanders, the first to cross, received a radio call from headquarters saying someone wants to talk to you. He recognized the voice as that of the Air Force commander, General Benny Peled. And Peled said, do you have a map? He said, yeah. Do you see the flowers on them? Those are SAM batteries. Please destroy them. Out.
Located on the western side of the canal, the Egyptian surface-to-air missiles had caused the Israeli Air Force heavy losses in the first days of the war. Now reachable by Israeli tanks, it was payback time for the Egyptian air defense. But despite the Israeli success in destroying the SAM batteries, other aspects of stout-hearted men were not going so well.
אבל אז אריק שרון קיבל פקודה לא להפעיל את הכוחות שלו ולא להתקדם, משום שהחשש היה שאם לא יצליחו להקים גשר ממש, גלילים או דוברות, אז אי אפשר יהיה לקיים ציר לוגיסטי, זאת אומרת לפנות נפגעים, לשלוח אספקה, לשלוח כוחות, ואז אפילו היה שיקול שיבטלו את כל המבצע.
The Israelis still hadn't gained control of the road to the crossing point. Foot soldiers would have to be used to flush out the Egyptian infantry and tank hunters from the ditches of the Chinese farm.
We were walking in the sands and a beautiful night in the Sinai where everything was totally quiet, and suddenly we're under heavy fire, attacked by really heavy fire and the superiority of the Egyptians in numbers and tanks, and we were with light arms.
During that long night, the Egyptians inflicted heavy losses on the paratroopers. 41 killed and over 100 wounded. But the action kept Egyptian forces occupied and brought the Israelis the opportunity to tow their pontoons forward to the crossing point. By the night of the 16th of October, having finally realized the scale of the Israeli operation, the Egyptians reacted. The plan was simple. The 25th Armored Brigade would move northwards to meet up with the 21st Division, which would advance southwards. In a pincer move, the two armored units would close the gap and crush the Israeli forces. The plan seemed straightforward, but to General Shezli, it was flawed. He wanted the brigade to cross to the west and make its assault on that side of the canal, which was under Egyptian control. General Ismail ordered that no forces that had already crossed to the east should cross back to the west. This, he said, was a political decision taken by President Sadat himself. Neither Ismail nor Shezli would back down until finally President Sadat was asked to come to the Egyptian main command center, known as Center 10, to arbitrate on this dispute between the top two commanders of his armed forces.
فبقول له يا سيادة الرئيس أنا مختلف مع سيادة الفريق أحمد إسماعيل. أنا قلت الكلام ده وانفجر فيا وقعد يزعق ويعمل ومش عارف ايه، وما تجيبش سيرة الانسحاب ده إطلاقا يا سيادة الرئيس. ده مش انسحاب، ده اسمها مناورة بالقوات. ما فيش مناورة بالقوات ولا فيش انسحاب، ما فيش عسكري ينسحب. أنا أقدمك للمحاكمة إذا جبت سيرة الانسحاب.
Sadat's decision was clear. The next day, 17th of October, at 0700 hours, the 25th Armored Brigade moved northwards to carry out his mission. But Chesley was about to be proved right.
חטיבה 25 למשל, שבאה מכיוון האגמים, והשתתפו במערב כזה נגדם שתי חטיבות טנקים, חטיבה 14, שרידי חטיבה 14 בצד אחד, וחטיבה 200 של נתקה. הקרב הזה נגמר בצורה מהירה מאוד.
The Egyptians suffered heavy losses. With 65 tanks destroyed, only 10 were able to retreat southwards.
حجم الخسائر في اللواء 25 مدرع كان مهول. يعني يمكن 90% من دباباتنا فقدناها، وده كان شيء يعني الحقيقة محزن، لأن دي كانت أفضل دبابة لدى الجيش المصري، دبابة T-62 معدلة. اللي أخطر منه ما حدث للوحدات المقاتلة اللي حوالينا، لأن كلهم كانوا بينظروا للواء 25 مدرع على إنه الدرع بتاعهم، على إنه مفخرة الجيش المصري. فما حدث للواء 25 مدرع سبب جرح لدى معظم الجنود اللي كانوا في المقدمة في هذه المعركة اللي احنا خضناها.
Meanwhile, in the northern sector of the Suez Front, things were no better for the Egyptians. After 2 days of heavy fighting over Chinese farm, the right flank of the Second Army had been decimated. The remnants of the brigade that had blocked the road to the canal had retreated, but only after making the Israelis pay a heavy price.
Yes, painful victory. Very painful, mainly because of the dead and the wounded. In one night of the crossing of the canal, we lost some 400 people. Tanks were fighting. Some of them we saw in broad daylight later, one barrel against another, like two sword combatants in the medieval time. But here they were, the tanks, both of them destroyed. Maybe most of the people in both of them dead. The valley of death next day along the canal was terrible. But we were on the other side of the canal.
General Adan's armored division had successfully crossed the canal using the pontoon bridge. Next day, 18th of October, early morning, Adan's tanks are unleashed on the Egyptian rear. Soon they have destroyed more SAM batteries, clearing the skies for the Israeli Air Force.
يظهر الطيران بتاعهم. طول الفترة اللي فاتت ما شفناش طيران بتاعهم نهائي. لحد يوم 17 بدأنا نشوف الطيران بتاعهم واضح، وبالتالي ما فيش حد بيحوش، وبقى أصبح القوات بتاعتنا اللي هي الصواريخ المضادة للطيارات أصبح ما لهاش وجود. طالما إن الطيران واخد حريته أصبح ما لهاش وجود.
On the 18th of October, the Israeli High Command decided to capitalize on the successful crossing, building their presence on the western bank of the canal to 3 armored divisions. Sharon's division would move north to surround the Egyptian Second Army and capture the city of Ismailia. Adan's division, and another commanded by General Magin, would move south to encircle the Egyptian Third Army and capture the city of Suez. This would be their final goal. Israel would come to the bargaining table, holding a trump card.
Israel now had 2 bridges working, the pontoon bridge, the roller bridge. They were now ready to bring an army across to the other side of the canal.
For 2 days, and with the bulk of the Egyptian army on the east of the canal, scattered forces in the west fought bravely, trying to hold their ground against 3 Israeli armored divisions. But they were outnumbered and overwhelmed. General Shazli could see that his plan was on the verge of failure.
أنا كنت في الجبل، نزلت قلت الموقف بقى خطير جدا، فقمت أنا جيت يوم 20 وقلت لازم أسحب كل لواء مدرع أقدر أسحبه من الشرق، لازم أسحبه الليلة. كان عندي 4 ألوية مدرعة في الشرق ما بيعملوش حاجة، قلت أسحب ال4 ألوية الليلة.
That night, once more, General Ismail had to request Sadat to come to the command center. The president was unmovable. He simply reiterated what he had said 4 days earlier.
القرار لا تسحب أي بندقية ولا دبابة من الشرق إلى الغرب. كل واحد يدافع في المكان الذي هو فيه. كلام الفارغ. هو في حرب في الدنيا بالشكل ده؟ ناس فيهم ضغط عليهم وما بتبعتلهمش معونة، وناس قاعدين فاضيين مش عايز تسحب منهم وتخليهم تزج بيهم في المعركة.
الفريق الشاذلي كان من النوع اللي هو لفترة كبيرة كان بيدير قوات الخاصة، يعني المظلات، يعني كلها نوعيات اللي فيها نوع من الريسك العالي. وكان أعتقد إنه هو كان إنسان فعلا يعني محترف، لكن في بعض الأحيان كان بياخد خطوات جريئة، ربما في فترات معينة زي اللي حصلت فيها إنه ربما تؤدي إلى مشاكل.
Sadat's position was clear. Any movement of forces from east to west could undermine morale and lead to the collapse of the whole front. His last bargaining chip would be lost.
وأنا سألت الحقيقة ناس كتير من اللي هم كانوا موجودين في ذلك الوقت، قالوا لو كنا شفنا يعني عسكري واحد راجع لورا كان الجيش كله هيرجع.
Shortly after midnight, Sadat left Center 10 and returned to his residency. He summoned the Soviet ambassador and told him that Egypt is ready to accept a ceasefire. This time, though, it was the Israelis who had no interest in a ceasefire.
We can say that Israel had a greater interest in the ceasefire not kicking in right at that moment because it still had work to do, still territory it wants to capture.
But in the third week of the war, international attempts to broker a ceasefire in the Middle East would bring the whole world to the verge of a nuclear confrontation.